40. To win in the world of deep discount, you beat the other guy's price and hope to capture his customers. So, for the next 2 years, Monis committed Farmore to underselling Walmart. But the prices were so low, he began losing money in those stores. Pat Finn watched nervously as year by year the profit margins of the entire company eroded. By 1989, he realized Farmore now faced a loss of millions. Finn went to Monis with the bad news.
Mickey Monis was in a tough position. 5 years into running what had seemed a white-hot company in a sizzling industry, he was losing money. What were his options? He could announce the losses and risk losing his credibility, his credit, and quite possibly his company, or he could buy a little time by parking the losses temporarily and put more effort into improving efficiency, getting lower prices from suppliers, something that would enable him to turn a profit once again. Monis chose to buy time, according to his chief financial officer. Pat Finn states that when he brought the disappointing results to his boss, Monis simply crossed them out with a pen and wrote in higher numbers showing a profit. Now, this was illegal, but the report was mainly an internal document. Farmore was lying primarily to its owners.
The true numbers were kept in a separate set of books called the subledger, and Farmore's accounting manager, John Anderson, was brought into the plot to keep track of the temporarily altered figures. Monis's inspiration was to squeeze upfront payments from vendors in return for not selling their competitors' products. He'd use these exclusivity fees to cover his losses. Coca-Cola, for instance, paid Farmore $10 million to keep Pepsi out of Farmore for just 5 years. Vendors let themselves be strong-armed by a retail newcomer without ever wondering, it seems, if the Farmore phenomenon was for real. Meanwhile, Farmore's accountants used the millions in exclusivity fees to help offset the losses they were hiding, which had now reached $18 million. But the fees were not enough. In reality, things at Farmore were a mess. Even with the exclusivity money, the company was still facing a $12 million loss, and the auditors were coming. So how do you make a $12 million loss disappear?
Well, you can start by dividing it up into smaller amounts. $12 million divided by 129 stores comes out to $93,023 and about 25 cents a store. So you put that on the expense side of each store's ledger. And to make it balance, you need to add $93,023 and about 25 cents to each store's assets. Now, you can't claim cash you haven't got. Any auditor can see through that. But you can claim another category of assets. Your inventory is worth more than it actually is. And that's the first thing they did.
So Farmore claimed every six-pack of Coke in the store was worth, say, $2.30, when in reality it may have sold for $1.98. Multiply that difference by thousands of six-packs of Coke in 129 stores, and you're on your way to a $12 million cover-up.
Moreover, Coopers, having won the Farmore account with a very low bid, wanted to limit its costs. So Coopers checked only 4 stores out of 129. And get this, Farmore found out from Coopers which locations would be checked months in advance. So when Coopers arrived to examine the stores, it's not too surprising that everything appeared to be in order.
With only a tiny sample to go by, Coopers accepted Farmore's inflated inventory figures year after year, even though Finn couldn't back them up with documents. In the end, the auditors not only bought Farmore's numbers, but declared that the company had actually earned a record profit. To cover up the continuing losses, Pat Finn was now faxing falsified financial reports to the board of directors and to David Shapira every week. But in November of 1990, a secretary mistakenly faxed a report with the real numbers to Shapira. Here, in black and white, was a report which no CEO could ignore. In the end, the CEO of Farmore failed to check the figures independently. He seems to have bought Pat Finn's excuse.
Now remember, we're 3 years into the fraud. Is CEO David Shapira really as gullible as he seems? Well, a cynic might say that considering Shapira's huge personal stake as a major shareholder in Farmore, he believed Finn because he wanted to.
Corporate partners wanted to invest $200 million. But first, quite naturally, they would send in their own accountants to check the books. A Farmore vice president told her that some vendors were refusing to supply stores because bills were going unpaid. Imbrie documented her concerns in a confidential memo to David Shapira, covering everything from disgruntled vendors to cash flow problems. Stan Cherylstein joined Farmore in 1990. He quickly rose to the position of controller, a job that placed him in charge of all cash disbursements.
Well, I learned about the fraud almost 2 years after my joining the company. That's when John Anderson took me into his office and closed the door and told me that, well, you're the controller for Farmore now, and you should be aware of this situation. And he pulled out a subledger schedule and told me basically that the financial statements at the end of June 1991 were misstated by approximately $150 million.
Hiding the fraud was becoming more and more of a problem. The company was frequently strapped for day-to-day cash. Bills went unpaid for months.
We had cabinets stuffed with held checks at the company that had been generated out of the accounts payable system, but we couldn't mail them because if we mailed them, the checks would have bounced. So they kept accumulating and accumulating.
By the spring of 1991, Farmore was holding back $155 million it owed to vendors.